Hi, welcome to the continuation of the AlteredTCG base set card review. This is going to cover the Yzmir characters and Yzmir heroes. Yzmir is the team that's associated with using spells and then getting weird effects out of the spells, or getting effects that remove the opponent's characters out of the spells. So often the characters they have enable you to do that better, or just are a little smaller than you might usually expect, like the Yzmir Stargazer, because the spells are supposed to be the most powerful effects. Often you only need like 1 or 2 stats after you've disrupted your opponent a lot to win one of the expeditions with just a few points. And Akesha and Taru is the starter deck character for the Yzmir, and she kind of gives off that concept in her own way by not giving you any statistics and not even giving you a character or anything like that. She just has the effect after you, so she just changes the timing of the round when you are the first player to give you more of an advantage. It's interesting to try to value the effect of after you because it varies wildly. Sometimes it's a huge effect because you have like 2 mid-sized characters, and if the priority system favored you, you can just cause one of them to be completely misplaced. And then other times you can know what you're going to play no matter what, and the priority might not matter. Like if one player's plan for the turn is that they're just going to start with an Atlas that they use a support ability on, after that happens, the priority system like stops functioning. Overall, I think it's hard to have multiple consecutive turns where the after you effect isn't relevant, because you're going to have a mixture of high cost and low cost cards, and eventually it's just going to happen. And I think it usually adds up to somewhere between like a boost and 2 boosts of value. So I think Akesha and Taru is probably the best character. Not obviously and clearly, but she's the one I would want to start with. Her ability gives you a lot of flexibility to try different strategies that you might be interested in, instead of sticking to only spells or only characters or anything like that. And I think the rate is pretty similar to the other 2 specialized heroes most of the time. We'll see how she pans out. This is one of the only one of only 2 characters where we have actually seen a nerf from early play to later play. She used to be able to do this even when she was a second player if she paid 2 mana. Lindiwe and Ma. Lindiwe and Ma can create a 0/0 companion token that will get 2 boosts every time you sacrifice a character. An important thing to note is that you may just sacrifice the Ma itself instead of sacrificing a character to gain boosts. I would say this actually happens probably more of the time if you look at the cards. Overall, if you look at the cards in this set that work with Lindiwe and Ma, because if you play nothing but vanilla characters, note that this has no effect. This does not even affect the priority rules because you immediately take your turn after using this effect. So this only keys off of cards that say sacrifice. And if you look at the total number of ones we have in the set, I think generally it feels like it's not enough. You look at Waru's list and you're like, whoa, there's a lot of bureaucrats here. If I add them all up, I can get most of my deck to be bureaucrats, and I would play most of them anyway. And Lindiwe and Ma is more like, oh, I can get a fraction of my deck to be sacrifice effects, and that's only if I use a bunch of ones that I wasn't going to play anyway. This is compounded by sacrifice itself being a strategy that asks for dependencies. Like, you want to play specific types of cards to make a sacrifice deck work better. You'd ideally want to play cards that have a special effect when they're sacrificed, in case you draw one of your big cards that requires a sacrifice. And even when you're not playing those cards, you would be restricted to like playing fewer spells and playing more medium-sized creatures, just in case you have to sacrifice one of those in a pinch. So she's not so strong that she is going to overpower these card pool issues. So I'm going to give Lindewe Amal a D, and I expect her to be pretty dependent on future card releases to see any use. Aphanis and Senka. Aphanis and Senka is also card pool dependent because nothing has any effect unless it's a spell, but when you play a spell you get an entire boost. This is at the maximum you could play a spell. You could play 2 spells every turn if you somehow manage to get only spells without fleeting and draw them every turn and play both of them. In practice, it's probably not realistic. This is probably maybe a boost, maybe like 3/4 of a boost, but really getting it when it counts. Or maybe it's like a boost and a quarter, somewhere around there. And then some of the cards that are creating these boosts were like kind of nudged, that you played some extra spells to try to make this work. An interesting thing about Aphanis and Senka in general is that there's a sub-theme of Anchored in Yzmir. And if you put lots of boosts on a character and anchor that character, because you're pretty confident that you can set that up, that's pretty confident you can set that up without getting removed, that would be the main issue with that strategy. But if you can get past that issue with the strategy, there's really great anchor characters in Yzmir, like the Cadgiran Mage Dancer. And there's an out-of-faction Spindle Harvester that comes anchored right away to just put counters on and use the counters twice. So there's that kind of strategy available for Aphanis. I'll give Aphanis a B. And in terms of being supported by this set, he's a lot closer to just already having all the cards he would want to have, kind of like Waru. He's somewhere between Waru and Lindewe in terms of set support, in my opinion, looking at the cards. So I'm not worried about that quite as much as maybe just having a preference for the After You ability and being really optimistic that I can get like 2 points of value out of that ability. But they're both exciting characters to build and play to me. Magical Training. This should be filtered for spells. One minute real quick. Why is it in French? Okay. And let's start with the in-faction cards. Fixed. Studious Disciple. Also costs 1, and also is Aphanis, so hopefully not too much of a switch there. This is an Aphanis-friendly card in that it reduces your spell costs. But something I would keep in mind is that you don't... I think this is the first time we've reviewed a card with the next spell you play this turn costs 1 less. I would say in general, in my experience playing the game, you can lose half a card doing this like 1 or 2 times a game, but if you were to do it constantly, it could really hurt you and empty out your hand in a way that's unfavorable. I think that's especially true on your 1-cost cards. You kind of want to play your 1-cost cards twice because the advantages, I've stated in a few videos that a small character that starts winning a lane is a great way to see what your opponent is going to do, and requires an answer even if that answer is too big to be appropriate to it. And this has 2 of the 3 stats, which is pretty good. So it's mainly for the base stats that we are going to give this an A. But this flexibility is really relevant, and this flexibility it's a better flexibility than if this was like a 0-1-2, which I think we've seen like on a rare or something. I would say it's more utility than that. It's something you might use in the right spot if you really need that mana. And it can also help keep your reserve from over flooding while still getting the best value out of all of your cards. This one is the Have Your Cake and Eat It Too. I think tying the play of the second Studious Disciple to a turn in which you're going to play a spell is not that great in Akesha. I guess in Aphanis, if you're playing so many spells that this is just kind of like you have one more mana orb this turn because you always play spells, this might be okay, but I imagine that Aphanis is going to be really hungry for rare points because Aphanis, every time Aphanis spends a rare point, he can grab a spell from a completely other faction and increase the number of spells in his deck that are solid to play. And for that reason, I'll go ahead and give this a C or a D because Akesha doesn't want it and Aphanis doesn't want it, and we're mostly going to discount Lindewe because she's not that good until she gets more cards. But as an aside, Lindewe does like the second ability, but doesn't really like the support ability. So, okay, we will make an exception for talking about Lindewe for the cards that are specifically meant for her. I think it would be uninteresting to totally skip on those, but this is the Moonlight Jellyfish, which is when I'm sacrificed, if I'm not fleeting, put me in reserve. This card is really funny to me because when I read it, I realized I had already assumed that when you sacrifice a non-fleeting character, you would get to play it the second time. And this corrected my assumption. I realized, oh, you have to lose the card entirely. So I was like, it's supposed to make you more excited about Lindewe when you find out about this card, but my misunderstanding of the rules meant it was bad news to me. However, you can probably just sequence your plays so that generally the thing you're sacrificing is already fleeting. So that's actually not a huge deal. And the Moonlight Jellyfish is low cost, so it's kind of filling that gap where if you're having trouble doing that all the time, then early in the game when it's hard to have something that you played from reserve to sacrifice, the Moonlight Jellyfish can be there really early. So I think it's really good at doing what Lindewe wants to do. It's also just actually, even outside of Lindewe, this is still 2/3 biome stats on a 1/1. And it does have a relevant ability if you play one or two of the sacrifice cards, and I don't think it takes that much. So I will go ahead and give this a B. I don't think it's truly dependent on playing Lindewe. I really could see you just like looking at the stats in your deck and feeling that the water in the forest on this matters more for the design of your deck than whether or not the Studious Disciple has that support ability. If you realized you were using one of the Lyra zeros and you didn't want that zero to match the same zero as Studious Disciple, you could just throw this in. When I'm sacrificed, if I'm fleeting, draw a card. I think this is really good in Lindewe and then not as good when it's being splashed in the other factions. I'll go ahead and throw a C at this. I would worry if you only have one or two sacrifice effects in your deck. It's difficult to sequence them to be sure that you get the rare point value out of this where you sacrifice it on the second play. Lindewe will be so chock full of those effects that she'll have an easier time, and it could play significantly better there. Unlike Aphanis, Lindewe doesn't have to worry about spending all her rare points to get more of her themed effect There aren't any outside of Yzmir, so. Tooth Fairy. I think this is the cheapest sabotage character in the set. You just pay 2 for a 1/1/1 and you sabotage. You usually sabotage at the start of a turn, especially if you're going first, because that keeps your opponent from playing out the card in reserve that you might want to hit. And if you keep in mind that you're playing a sabotage card early like that, a 1/1/1 is actually a really good stat distribution if you're not overpaying for it. We're overpaying for it by a little bit, but not by like, a ton. Or we're paying the amount of extra mana we would expect to pay for the sabotage effect. So this is a really good dovetail between the timing of when you're going to play this card and what kind of biome stats you would want at that timing. For that reason, I will give Tooth Fairy an A. I think she'll complement Akesha really well. You could sabotage the cards that aren't susceptible to your After You abilities, and then use After You on the cards that don't work very well against After You, and kind of eliminate everything that way. And I think in Afanis might prefer to not be spending a whole lot of mana on his characters, so that he has more mana for spells, so this should play fine. Really a blank hero would like this character. This is pretty similar. You pay 1 less the second time you play it. I am going to pass on this, but I think this is like a good rate. And if your deck was really focused on sabotaging a lot, it wouldn't be surprising that you would just take this mana discount and expect to play it very, very often. Like if you were going for a strategy of like exhausting your opponent's hand, is when you would be interested in this. If you're more just surgically removing 1 or 2 of their key cards and then using your own cards after that, you might not be confident you'll play Tooth Fairy both times, and then you might be worried about getting the value out of the second play. I'll give this a B. 1 cost effects are very powerful, so I'm loath to give a very low rating to anything with a 1 on it. Speaking of anything with a 1 on it, Khadgar Mage Dancer. When you play a spell, I gain 1 boost. This is very, very exciting in Afanis. I mentioned earlier that like Afanis can anchor this and get like a ton of boosts off the character ability, a ton of boosts off Khadgar Mage Dancer's ability, maybe some boosts off the spells themselves. I don't remember which ones Yzmir has. And you can anchor him once, you can anchor him twice, you can anchor him 3 times sometimes, which could mean winning, 3 or 4 lanes. If this gets removed, depending on how much mana you poured into it, you might be okay, because it's starting out pretty cheap, especially the back half. So you might be able to have a plan for recovering from that too. It's not all in the same way that Hydrocana would be all in and very dependent on its sticking. I'll give Khadgar Mage Dancer an A. Akesha can get her own different way of value out of it. She might not have the extra spells and extra boosts, but she might have extra ways to make sure the opponent isn't in a good position to sabotage this. Like Akesha might play a 1-drop, and then the opponent might play something, then Akesha might turn sideways, the opponent might play something, and then you could drop this and you could have only spent 2 mana for your turn, and your opponent's already played 2 cards. If they were like 3 each, your opponent just like doesn't have mana, and then you could anchor this and play a bunch of spells. So I think you could play it in Akesha too, but Akesha would be less shocking to skip over this card. I probably should have looked at the rare before giving it a grade. At Dusk, if I have 3 or more boosts, draw a card. I will give this another A. This is probably the version Afanis wants to play. This might not be the version Akesha wants to play, because Akesha might want to mana zone Khadgar and Mage Dancer sometimes and go for a less vulnerable strategy. But Afanis will have so many spells in the deck, I imagine that he can just like be sure that he will draw the card at least once, like maybe gets removed the next turn. And drawing 1 card for a rare point is kind of like the going rate. This can draw 2 cards for a rare point because you're very likely to anchor this. That's kind of the strategy that works best with the Mage Dancers. So you would draw a card, even if it's just 1 anchored, you would draw a card the first dusk and the next dusk. Yzmir Stargazer, a 1/2/1. These are not great stats, but the Yzmir don't get to have super great stats. It's kind of like the faction differentiation that Yzmir doesn't have super great stats. And they are giving us something here. What they're giving us is that this can be played for 1, which is something that can be useful to play a character for 1. I will give this a C. I think usually when I've put together decks, I haven't had to resort to this. The risk of these poor stats losing you an expedition before you even get to play the exciting 1-cost version is pretty reasonable. So we would probably want to find a way around playing this. It does have 1 good mountain stat, so maybe really low counts of it work a little better. The rare version has well-rounded stats. It loses the 1-cost play, but you can send boosts to a character when it's sacrificed. So this is clearly intended for Lindiwe. This is a 2-cost. This is a 2-cost 4/4/4 functionally for her, because Maul will get up to 4, and then you can also spread those boosts around. They don't have to all be in the same place. If the set was full of cards like this, Lindiwe would be in a good spot. I think this is a pretty good deal for her. But for the other 2, the 1 or 2 cards you have in your deck aren't going to be enough reason to do this. Because you just get the 2 boosts, you don't get the 2 Maw boosts. So you're maybe like getting. You have to line up a specific combo to get 2 boosts ahead of rate, and that's a little bit less than what you want for a rare, I think. We'll give this a D until Lindiwe is playable. Lady of the Lake, 1/1/3. So more low statted characters. Go ahead and look at the rare right away. It's a 1/1/3 with the next spell you play this turn loses fleeting. A lot of really powerful spells have fleeting, so this could double a pretty powerful effect. Even though this is kind of hinting at Afanis, I kind of think it would be stronger in Akesha, because I would want to play like really powerful spells that have fleeting because they're so powerful and play them twice. And Afanis probably plays a lot of cheap expendable spells, possibly that already don't have fleeting, so that he can play more. So he might not be in the best position to use this. Actually, I guess the second time you play any spell, it counts as having fleeting. Regardless, I would still want to double something with the fleeting keyword. This Lady of the Lake, I will give a C, because it does have a nice water stat, and if you look at all the characters in Yzmir, you could have to resort to this actually, especially if you don't want to spend rare points. This one I will give the same C. You have to line up this effect to get value, and it's costing you a rare point. And I think I'm a little more excited by the Ada Lovelace and some of the other rares that play with these themes. I prefer to not need the very specific timing this has, where it needs to be in reserve when you're playing the high value spell with fleeting. That is a concern with the effect. So here's an example of an advantageous effect that we can play anytime in contrast. Baku says, target opponent discards a card from their hand. I think you can play the rare Hathor in Yzmir, so you could use that to play Baku multiple times. This is a pretty powerful effect. This is discarding 2 halves of a card from your opponent's resources. So like a 3-cost 2/2/2 is what you would expect for a sabotage. A 4-cost 2/2/2 to scale that up and have the sabotage be taking on this unique, even more disruptive form. I think that's a really good deal. You could even make your opponent like stuck on mana. So this seems like it might be a key piece in some attrition strategies for Yzmir. It definitely seems to lean more towards a Kesha. I will give this an A. I also like that it has a character attached. It's a way of getting ahead of the other factions and beating them by playing a different game from them. And then it also has character stats to make sure you actually advance. Whereas if you go too crazy with the permanents that don't actually have stats, you could remove your opponent's whole board and then not actually advance or something like that. So I really like Baku. I would be excited to try to jam 3 Bakus in a deck and see if I can run my opponent out of cards as a way of winning with Yzmir. This one is even more discards. I'll give this an A again. I think it's reasonable to commit to this or not commit to this. It is true that if you keep playing this a lot of times, you're putting a 2/2/2 onto the board a lot of times, and you're losing a lot of expeditions. But you need cards to play the game, so if you really go hard on this strategy and it does actually work, and that's an if, because I haven't experimented this with enough. There's a lot of times you encounter a new card game and discarding isn't as big a deal as you might think it is. But if it does work, I think having well-rounded character statistics alongside the effect and being at a good affordable cost of 4 is going to turn out really well as a strategy for Yzmir. And because only Yzmir has this effect, other decks won't necessarily be chock full of strategies that try to deal with it, like drawing extra cards to have them to discard or anything. Baba Yaga. Did I write the grade on the screen? I'll write it on the screen real quick. Okay. Baba Yaga. It is a 2/2 that draws a card. It doesn't draw a card the second time. I'll give Baba Yaga a D. I think it's nice to review this right after Baku, because Baku kind of demonstrates an effect where the body is too small to win unless the opposing expedition has been cleared out by removal. But the effect is like really unique and interesting and could win the entire game by the effect it has on the game, where the effect could be that your opponent just stops playing cards. Baba Yaga is the same. It's the same amount of understatedness, and that it's enough understatedness that you expect to start losing expeditions. But you could draw some cards and still lose. It's not a win condition. It's just something that's nice to have. So I don't really like Baba Yaga. If we're going to have to play small characters a certain amount of the time, I would rather do it on the Baku or the other special characters we'll see that really make that pitch to you. This isn't enough to help. Still 8D is some slightly better stats, but there's still enough risk that you lose lanes here that we're not sold on it. Let's go to the next page. Kagir Alchemist. 3 costs the first time as a 3/3, and then 1 costs the second time as a 1/1. And the rare starts as a 4/4 and becomes a 1/1/1. I'm going to give both of these an A. I think it's a great way to get a 1-cost 1/1/1 into your possibilities to open with a 3/3/3 common. I think it's even better to spend a rare point and get a 4/4/4 because Yzmir isn't really allowed to get those kinds of stats most of the time. And then getting a 1/1/1 on the back half and being able to play really slow turns and see what your opponent is going to do and all those things that are celebrated the most in Yzmir, but every altered faction does. They're both good halves. The front side is good and the back side is good, and you're filling a gap that is a gap for the faction. So that's why I think this is an A that I would really rush to include. Even though this is only 1/1/1 of stats, I'm excited to pay a rare point for it because the stat line doesn't appear elsewhere in the set that I remember, and because you'll probably play this every single time you draw it. Alice, 2/2/4 with a support ability of After You. And Alice can also be a 3/3/4. I am excited to see if I can use the support ability, so I'm going to prefer not to play the rare version because I can only use these stats once, and it's not quite as many stats as Kagir and Alchemist. I'm going to give Alice an A. This second ability is even better than a 1-drop sometimes. Sometimes it's a little worse because it can't actually start winning a lane. But in the middle of a turn, the flexibility of being able to do that effect for 0 is really unique and unexpected, and not something that's probably available in your hand in a different way. So it can be really powerful to see what your opponent is going to do and then play a card. And this stat line is pretty unique for Yzmir, pretty solid. You can also just play the 2/2/4 a second time. Characters with only 1 good stat can often be like pretty powerful played twice, because you can block your opponent from advancing on the mono water space and then go to the mono water space again because you were successful. And Yzmir is one of the factions that could be the very best at doing that because they have a lot of removal. Flammel. You may return a spell from your reserve to your hand. This timing is a little... I think this is overall a little more flexible than Lady of the Lake. But it requires a spell that you're returning to not be fleeting in the first place. Otherwise, you'd have trouble getting it into your reserve. Flammel is paying very little stats for this special effect. Very little stats. Paying no stats on the second play to not have a special effect, and actually being overstatted on the second play. So I'm going to give Flamel an A, which I had stuck on the screen there. And the support ability is going to be pretty auxiliary. I've mentioned the value of that ability before. It is a little bit better on a 1-drop, or on a 4-drop. But we're already in for this. I'm already sold on everything else on the card. Resupply, then you may return a spell from your reserve to your hand. So this makes it possible to bypass the limitation I just said. However, I don't think I want to spend a rare point on a resupply, but maybe I do. I will give this a C. I'll probably look towards the other ways of getting ahead on cards in the faction though, like the magical training. Kuat the Dissenter. Sacrifice a character in my expedition. 5/5/5. So the thing you sacrifice could be Maw. If you sacrifice Maw, you're getting a forest stat and a mountain stat more than Kappa would have, which is not super impressive if that's what you picked your hero to do. If you manage to sacrifice like a sleeping character, that would be pretty exciting. Then with Maw you could get like 7/7. But really this isn't a strong starting point. Outside of Lindewe, you pretty much would have to be playing Ortis Carrier to do this at all, and then you're only adding 4/4/4 stats to the Ortis Carrier lane. And then you can't even play it in whichever lane you want. So I'm going to give Kuat a D. I'm not very impressed. I will say, like, the Yzmir Stargazer was giving a more impressive pitch for the sacrifice theme. So really the quantity of sacrifice effects is just not high enough, and then not being able to fully count the ones like this is why I don't think you get all the way there for Lindewe. For 3, sacrifice a character from any expedition. This is a bit better, but I'm still going to give it a D. We do have to fulfill the condition multiple times before we can access that cheaper reserve cost, and it's just not impressive enough overall. The back half, even if you destroy one of your own characters, you're getting the same benefit as just like the plant character who cares about plants, just looking at the plants around him. So when you compare this to what other factions are doing, this isn't really helping you beat the rates that they're paying, and you might as well just play a spell from your hand to remove one of their things. Yansu, that's the card I was thinking of. Dorothy Gale. You may send a character to reserve. This is a really exciting card because it could remove something that's like a 6/6/6 or an 8/8/8 and then leave behind this 3/2/2. And you could pay less than the thing that you're getting rid of when you play her. This is a pretty reasonable way to win some lanes. And this is a good way to try to increase the number of cards in your hand. Maybe on turn 5, this is just the only thing you play on turn 5. You'll go into turn 6 with more cards in hand than if you needed to play 2 cards out turn 5. The second play is a 3/2/2, which would be pretty bad for any other faction and is still kind of bad for Yzmir, but not as bad. I'm going to give Dorothy Gale a B. I'm not over the moon about her, but I think she is pretty appealing. This one I like less because I think you're not going to be awash in opportunities to pay 5 and remove something huge. You're going to have a limited number of times you can do that per game. So I would probably rather have the 3/2/2 backside, or at least it's close enough to be a wash where I don't want to spend the rare point. So I'm going to rate this a D, because I'm going to feel a little worried I can't find a target for the second play of Dorothy Gale, and after a while I might have to discard my rare from reserve because I couldn't find a target. The Kraken. All regions become water. You have to sacrifice 2 characters to play it, and it's gigantic. It is the equivalent of a 7-cost 16/16/16. If you count both expeditions and you count what it's doing to the biomes. But you have to sacrifice 2 things. The rare is to sacrifice only 1 character. I think I'd probably play the rare if I was playing this, but it's hard to be sure. I'll give them both the same grade. There's a few ways that you could enable this, and I don't think you necessarily have to be playing Lindewe to enable this. You just have to be against an opponent that doesn't have so many resources they can't deal with this. The Ortis Carrier can help you. The Spindle Harvester can help you. It can also just help you to have a lot of turns that your opponent didn't advance, so you're getting more and more mana, and you can just play characters before you play this. That can help you. I'm more interested in like the Baku way of winning the game. You could combine them together, actually, but I would rather combine some other things. So I'm going to give this just a C. This is really hard to evaluate. I don't think there's any way to immediately disqualify it. I think 7-cost 16/16/16 is like a compelling rate, and I am willing to play something as conditional as a 7-cost and play something as conditional as requiring sacrifices to go for that. It would just be the second or third deck I'd build, not the first. I will say this might be, let's say it's a B. This might be like a really important way to counter specific characters with specific stat skews to where 1 or 2 in your deck has a really impressive potential. Like against the Lyra faction, or even the slightly imbalanced characters like Robin Hood. It might be nice to flip everything to water. Sakurabru. This is the one I would rather pair with Baku rather than Kraken, although I might pair cheap characters with Baku. Your opponent's expedition facing mine moves back 1 region. Sometimes this is small enough that the region resets right away, but in other contexts that means the card is bad. Here, that doesn't necessarily mean you messed up, because maybe if you didn't play a card like this, you were going to do even worse than like losing both lanes and pushing something back. This can be a good way to just like get up to higher amounts of mana without losing twice. Even if you lose both sides, the net loss will be at most 1. I guess you could say this is like a celebration day on a stick in that regard. But it's not outlandish to get these 4/4 stats to win, or I think the rare is even more reasonable to win with. Yes. I will say a C for the common and a B for the rare. This support ability is very nice. It's drawing you a card so that you, well, a 5/5/5 is better than a 4/4/4, but this is a lot of flexibility in what to do after you've played 1 Sakurabru. And if your reserve is kind of full the turn you play the Sakurabru, I guess you can't use it immediately the way timing works. So it's not helpful on Mana Orb 7. But I like the stat buff here. You probably don't want to play the full 3 of these. This is one of those effects where I'm wondering if you really want to play it over and over again. But I think 1 or 2 of these is a good way to close out the game or move towards the close. Promo. Add a Lovelace. You may put a card from your hand in reserve. If it's a spell, draw a card. I'm going to give this an A. This is that combination of 2-cost character with good enough stats with a special effect that gets you ahead that I've liked in the past. This is lower stats than I usually see on those things that are getting me excited, but Yzmir has slim pickings sometimes. Finding a 3 mountain stat on a 2 might be like a pretty good deal in Yzmir. And drawing an entire card just because you moved a fleeting spell to a zone where it's going to have the same effect, it's really exciting. You're willing to take some risks on the water and forest to do it, I think. And I think it's worth the rare point. I might not play all 3 though, since they need to be played from reserve. And that means if I draw multiple of them in the same game, that could be tricky. Red has Seasoned. So this is an Aphanis card, I would say. Because the boost you get from using Aphanis will stick around on red. I'm thinking a little bit. I'm going to go with an A for Aphanis' use of it. I think even though we're paying a rare point and the original common red was exciting because we were getting so much value without spending any rare points at all, this is a really good way to start winning a lane, you lose a lane, you play a spell to re-win the lane, and then hopefully you have a good turn. Whether or not you have a good turn, this will be like a 2-cost 4/4/4. So you can make some fairly even exchanges the turn you play it, and then be above rate on a future turn. That's really appealing. And then it has all the flexibility of a 2-cost 2/2/2, so that in the bad situations where that dream world isn't lining up, you know, I've criticized some other cards for concerns that they might not line up their dream world. This is a 2-cost 2/2/2, so it can be better than, you know, the Lady of the Lake. I'm worried about not finding its target. This is a better stat amount than that. Hua Mulan. Hua Mulan loses fleeting. Yzmir has a strategy that's way more conducive to this than Bravos, I think. Bravos wants to defeat their opponent before who has the most cards matters, in some builds at least. While Yzmir might try to trade all their cards away and then have one thing that can really outlast. Unfortunately, I think these numbers are like a little too small to go for that. I might be really interested in pulling a unique of this to try to get the numbers higher, since I'm going to be using those numbers over and over and over again. I can't remember for sure, but maybe this was 133 on the Bravos, and they actually recognized that this would be really good for Yzmir and toned it down. I'll give this a C. I think the conversion rate isn't quite good enough, and it's a low enough conversion rate. I would be looking at trying to draw extra cards or using a permanent to get this outlast dynamic. I will say though, it is a 2-cost average stat way of getting to that outlast, so it might be the right way to do it. It could be the most flexible way to do it. But I'm pretty worried about repeatedly bringing a 1 forest into the game over and over again. That could be the thing that lets your opponent advance on you several times and then ends the game before you're really outlasting. Bravos Blade Dancer. It's seasoned and gains a boost every time you play it. And that is similar to red. I think you could just play both. I think seasoned is just, for Ephanis specifically, I think just these seasoned characters just might be so good that you're playing the in-faction Yzmir spells so that you can play them. And so good that you're playing them over the characters that don't have seasoned. I'm just going to give this an A again. I think this really fits what Ephanis is trying to do. It's letting you play your even exchange removal spells and then later somehow be ahead because you did that. Hathor, return another card from your reserve to your hand. This is an A. This one makes me think of Nevenka more than Ephanis, but it's probably really great in both of them. This card's really exciting to me because it's 3/3, which in the faction is tricky stats to get to. They don't have like a Bravos Tracer or anything. And also the faction I think the faction could be pretty good at getting these stats to the right location. If you're waiting and seeing what your opponent is doing using after you, it might be easier to use these inflexible characters like this. And then we have this reserve ability, and it's almost impossible to construct a game state where this reserve ability isn't good. If your reserve is overflowing, it always cleans it up. If your best card is a character, you can return the character to your hand. If your best card is a spell, you can return the spell to your hand. If your best card is in play because you're anchoring it and it hasn't been removed yet, well, you're probably in a good spot anyway, so who cares what this ability does? So it's kind of a win-win-win character. Lyra Scald. You may discard a card from your reserve to resupply, and you can discount a card. The top effect is not a full card's worth. The bottom effect is one I've described as mediocre before. So this is a D. We're getting a 0 stat, and we're not getting as many 3 stats as Hathor, and then we're getting pretty mediocre effects. I would be surprised if this saw play, really. Runa Caregiver. Target character with hand cost 3 or less gains anchored. I think the amount of rares I've given an A might be too many for you to build Yzmir decks if you... Not that you should formulaically just put A's in a deck, but the disparity might be more remarkable than some of the other factions. But this is going to be another card where I would like to give this an A. This is going to multiply Ephanis' boosts so that they can be reused. This is going to let Akesha poke her opponent and wait to see what her opponent is going to do. The anchored effect is a little funky in Akesha because you have at least, if you anchor something cool, your opponent has at least a little bit of information about how to play their turn. They're like, okay, well, I need to go beat that thing you anchored. So you're not as able to use after you and your cards with after you to make your opponent make the wrong plays. But the raw stats from spending 0 to anchor 3 or less just might make that worth it anyway. So A just on Ephanis alone, and it probably overpowers that anti-synergy in Akesha, I might think. Spindle Harvesters. I gain Anchored, and it's a 1/0/0, and no other effects. Having seen how many other seasoned characters I wanted to include for Faunus, and I think I like those seasoned characters better than the Spindle Harvesters, I'm actually going to give this lower than I thought I would. I'll give this a C. So the second use of this has that dynamic I mentioned with the Kesha, where you're giving your opponent a little information so the after you is a little less dynamic. And then with a Faunus is seeming pretty overloaded with rare so far. And in terms of using boosts twice, this might not be the best way to do that, because if you play this to a lane and your opponent just doesn't start contesting that lane, then you might have to boost this when you're just like rubbing it in on that lane instead of winning that lane. And I guess the same thing can happen with red too, but I like that you can play red wherever you want on the next turn, which is pretty cool. Spindle Harvesters has this thing where Spindle Harvesters can wander into a biome where it's not doing anything. So if you play this to an expedition and your opponent refused to fight you there because they were afraid of the 2-for-1 value, and then your Spindle Harvesters wandered into a lane where only water matters, then suddenly you have to boost the Spindle Harvesters just so that you can start playing that lane. And Yzmir has a surprising amount of access to 1-cost characters already. This is usually a 1-cost character with a special effect, which is something that's rare, but it's not as rare in Yzmir, I've noticed. Sneezer Shroom. I gain Anchored. At noon, I gain 1 boost. I think the interesting thing about this card is that you could play 3 of these and 3 of the Kegir Mage Dancer and kind of try to say, these cards will play similarly. I'm going to play similar strategies with both of them. The Mage Dancer is better, probably, but they're both going to do similar things, and I can make a really consistent deck. I initially think I would probably prefer some of the better rate things rather than doing that. Oh, this rate's not terrible. I think we're squeezed for rare points though. This might play better in... It plays a little better in Akesha, but again, I'm not excited about Anchored in Akesha. I'll go ahead and give this a D. I don't think you should actually do the 6 copies of something like Mage Dancer. I think that's a cool strategy, but I don't think you should actually do it. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a D. Ortis Trooper. 1/1/1. This has no special effect, but it does have the best stat spread for a 1-cost 1/1/1. I'm going to give this a D because we've seen a few other ways to get a 1-cost. I'd probably rather max out those Kekiran Alchemists and maybe even just spend the rare point on the Tooth Fairy, because is Tooth Fairy the second 1-cost one? I think that's right. Yeah, I would rather spend a rare point on the Tooth Fairy. These are those other ways of increasing my 1-cost count instead of playing this, since this has no special effect. I'll go ahead. I'll give it a D. One in each stat is too good. But this isn't my favorite of the 1-drops we've seen so far. Whoops. Ortis Cadets. You can create a soldier token in the same expedition, and then the next spell costs less. This is in the set to support the sacrifice theme of Lindewe, because Lindewe can sacrifice something that's smaller than a 1/1/1 here and keep the token. This is kind of like a mild amount of stats. Yzmir doesn't have a lot of cool ways to buff it. You're trying to get this support ability to make up for it, but overall I think this is lackluster. I think the next spell you play costs 1 less, is only good 1 or 2 times, and you could get the common into play to use that effect 1 or 2 times if you really liked it. So this is going to be a D. Monolith Legate. When my expedition fails to move forward during dusk, sabotage after rest. I think a lot of people would say that they think of Yzmir as controlling, and because this is controlling, they think this fits Yzmir. I would say I actually am not sure about that, because I feel like Yzmir can be really good at winning expeditions with small characters. So Yzmir might be the faction where, even though this is a small character, it wins. And the more this wins, the more this is a vanilla character. So when I think about Akesha, I expect Akesha to be able to see what the opponent is going to do and figure out exactly what stats are needed in which expeditions to win. And if she discovers that information and then just intentionally loses a lane because she wants to sabotage, well then what was the point? What was the point of playing this instead of a Tooth Fairy? I think that doesn't add up to me. I think it would make more sense in Afanis as an insurance policy against turns that are not going well, rather than Akesha. But I'm still going to give this... yeah, I'll give it a D. I think you're looking for ways to win with stat points. That's the thing that Yzmir is bad at. And playing a character that has to intentionally lose a lane, I think exacerbates the key issue with making a good Yzmir deck. Monolith Archivist. I think this also exacerbates the key issue with building a good Yzmir deck. I think it's important to win expeditions, even if you plan to go really late into the game. The fewer expeditions you have to win once you get late into the game, the less threatened you are by your opponent banking all of your tempo into one specific turn to get their one final advancement. I mentioned that before in the Ortis video, where we saw a lot more of these kind of things. I'm going to give this a D. And we'll move on. Ortis Attorney. My expedition fails to move forward during dusk. Draw a card. I think this is more interesting in Afanis than the Legate, because Afanis could be doing some really silly and weird things with lots of cards in hand. I don't think this is probably the best way to do it. We'll give this a C. This is a little more harmonious with Afanis. It's a talk. Your other expedition and the expedition facing it can't move forward. This is fascinating in Akesha because you guarantee that you are able to put the effect onto an expedition where your opponent has played a character. Whereas if you go into your six cost turn and you have to play first, normally you would have to just guess which lane to put the Isatok in, and you would always guess wrong. So this has like a real synergy with one of the character abilities. And Akesha is significantly less strained for rares than Afanis. I like that too. I'm gonna give this an A. I think it might actually be easier to use this to do what Alice does better, in Akesha specifically. Not Alice, Dorothy, different woman. I think you could do what Dorothy does better with this if you can look at which lane your opponent has played a big character to, play this in the other lane. Hopefully they have few enough stats they can't beat 4/4/4. I think a 4/4/4 is going to accomplish that a lot better than a 3/2/2. So this is this is better at not being quite as small as the Dorothy. Anubis. Each player sacrifices a character. So, the thing about this card is that most people like to play their cheapest character first. And that's a big problem for trying to get a lot of mileage out of this card, because you're only getting the difference between your smallest character and your opponent's smallest character most of the time. Occasionally you can surprise your opponent, occasionally you can get really far ahead, but you have committed a rare point, you've committed the conditional of being able to sacrifice a character, and you've committed 5 mana. That's like in your 5 mana play. You mana zoned cards to set up a 5 mana play. That's a lot of cost for something that might not work. So I think this is going to fail when your opponent isn't even playing around it. They're just playing altered naturally, playing their cheap cards first. I think this might fail too much, and I think this won't be great. Thoth. When my expedition fails to move forward during dusk, create 2 1/1/1 soldier tokens and target expedition. I guess similar thoughts to the other bureaucrats we've seen so far. This time we're kind of like ending up with an anchored effect, which I said I wasn't crazy about in Akesha. So we'll give this a D. I'm not sure how this is really fitting in to the plan here. This is page 3. Is this cards we've seen? Oh, this is alternate arts. Okay, we are done. This video ran slightly longer. I hope you enjoyed looking at all these Yzmir characters. It's pretty fun to look at the thing that is not the theme of the faction. I felt like the Luna spells and permanents were fun since they're about characters. I felt like the Yzmir characters were fun since they're actually about spells. I'll try to bring out a spells and permanents video for Yzmir as soon as I can. And we'll try to see what Ephanis is actually throwing at people. Thanks for watching.